Well, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be invited to speak to you. This is a pretty packed presentation, and I'm going to go through it quite fast. So I do hope you can all keep up. There's a lot to talk about, far more than I could possibly do in the time allocated. So it's going to be quite a race against time. The Royal Parks, some people think they may need no introduction, but I would like to introduce them to you. The 8 Royal Parks were enclosed between the 15th and 17th century, often as deer parks, sometimes as gardens. And these days, we the Royal Parks, manage the land on behalf of the monarch under the Crown Lands Act. In 1993, the Royal Parks were created anew, as it were, with a selected group of properties, and were allocated to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And we remain an agency of the DCMS. And I thought, in case anybody here needs reminding who our Secretary of State is, it's Tessa Jowell, and our Minister is David Lammy. The Royal Parks are quite a wide estate spread right across London, starting with the Longford River here in the west. This starts just above Heathrow, springs off the River Colne, and feeds water through to Hampton Court Palace, and the Royal Parks manage the Longford River. Bushy Park, Richmond Park, which is the most designated of our sites. It's a national nature reserve. It's a site of special scientific... There's a good one to start with when you're nervous. A site of special scientific interest and a European SAC, which is a special area for conservation. We have the Brompton Cemetery, Kensington Gardens, Hyde Park, Grosvenor Square Gardens sticking in there, Regent's Park, Primrose Hill, St James's, Green Park and Victoria Tower Gardens, and right into the east, Greenwich Park. So quite a lot of properties. We also look after 10, 11 and 12 Downing Street Gardens as well, though I don't get involved in that. So just to give you some sort of corporate facts, really, to start with, overall we're responsible for something over 2,000 hectares, that's something over 5,000 acres of multi-purpose open space. And it often surprises people to realise just how much infrastructure we have to manage, over 280 buildings and monuments, 32 miles of roads, and so on. I won't read the entire list out, but you can see it there. The bottom one of those is also an interesting figure, somewhere between 150,000 and 175,000 trees. Don't know exactly, obviously a waste of somebody's time to count every one, but it's a lot, and a great deal of responsibility involved in looking after them. Have about 96 directly employed staff, and we welcome over 30 million visitors from certainly more than 100 countries. I think the key thing about the Royal Parks is their position in the heart of London. You can see that very clearly here, how they stand out as green space embedded in a very dense urban matrix. And just to give you a flavour of the parks, I'd just like to sort of run through some pictures of the parks to show the kind of scope of what we have. Many historic monuments, sites also steeped in much more recent history, but nevertheless history, the Brompton Cemetery. We have sculptures and monuments all over the place, but sometimes in very inspired locations. This is the Henry Moore statue, standing figure knife edge in Greenwich Park, liked by some, loathed by others. I like it, as it happens. Stunning views over London. This is from Primrose Hill, but there are equally stunning views from Richmond Park and Greenwich as well. We offer spectacle and tourism opportunities, which I think are pretty unrivaled, and I think a very high standard in horticulture. This is the Isabella plantation in Richmond Park, but I could show you a part of just about any park we have and get similar quality horticulture. Tranquil Parkland, this is Hyde Park. And peaceful backwaters in all the parks mostly have lakes and quiet little nooks. This is the Regent's Park, but then behind Regent's Park we also have the Regent's Canal and the delightful towpath walk along there. We have historic deer parks, Greenwich Park, Bushy Park, Richmond Park, all currently have deer herds. And our natural environments provide a really important resource for people, huge leisure and cultural value, and places for healthy exercise. I think if perhaps you were taking a jog, you might choose an environment like this. It's a pretty high standard of environment to go for a trot in. And lots of opportunities to do it, no matter who you are, horse riders or indeed disabled people who aren't able to cycle by themselves. In Bushy Park, there's an assisted cycling scheme where people are taken on rides. We offer educational programs, and these involve opportunities for learning and family activities generally, and open days, guided walks, things of that kind, places where people can enjoy a wide range of wildlife, even if they're not particularly experienced in it beforehand. And really, there is just an enormous diversity of wildlife to be enjoyed. And in all seasons as well. And, you know, in the depths of winter, it's cold, it's slushy, you go out, you see a sight like this, it's very, very heartwarming. Now, the parks are truly multi-purpose. Obviously, my interests lie in the biodiversity and the wildlife management of the parks, but they really are for all kinds of activity. Sport, all kinds of leisure activity, including just sitting down on a bench. And really, the idea of the parks, the modern image of the parks, is that we want to be there to promote the well-being of Londoners and indeed visitors to London. Just to give you a figure of how many people enjoy certain parts of the parks, it might be interesting for people to have a figure here. In fact, the Diana Memorial Fountain in Hyde Park, widely decried by many, attracts or has attracted over the last year an average of 73,000 visitors per month. You know, this is pushing the right buttons for a lot of people. 6,000 children and their parents attended a Peter Pan celebration, the treasure hunt in Kensington Gardens in July 2005. 85,000 visited the week-long World War II event in St James's Park. So these are very important open spaces for events and for attracting people. And this is therefore not just all about wildlife, it's about people and wildlife. Faked picture, I don't have an original, I'm afraid, but sheep were grazing originally in Hyde Park until the 1950s, but then a more amenity approach to management took over, and this kind of relatively bald grassland, which you see in some parts of Hyde Park, able to absorb enormous visitor impact, became very much the norm for most of the park. However, in the 1980s, some survey work by landscape architects noticed, really, that an area of about 4 hectares in Hyde Park contained relict grasslands, vestiges of acid grassland and ancient meadow, and medieval field vestiges of medieval fields. And it was proposed that this be turned into a meadow, and the management was changed dramatically so that the grassland could develop much more. And it was cut only once a year, or sometimes twice, depending on how it was felt it was appropriate. And in addition to that, there was a programme of planting plugs and sowing wildflowers, about 22 species altogether. They didn't all successfully take, only about 7 actually have lasted the course. But as the intensive management has been allowed to disappear and a more natural sward has developed, it has nevertheless become much more biodiverse all by itself. The hay cut technique that we've been using is very good because you don't cut too short, and when you cut the grass, you allow it to lie for a while before collecting it, allowing invertebrates and seeds to drop out. Now, this was working quite well, and certainly the results were good to look at. This is, I must admit, a slightly flattering photo of the meadow in Hyde Park. It can look considerably worse than that, but at its best, it certainly does look this good. And what we wanted to do really was not just to make it good for the wildflowers, but improve it for the invertebrates. And in the meadow, we divided it up into compartments, and what we've been doing since 2003 is leaving uncut areas, refuge areas, because insects lay their eggs, many do, lay their eggs in the plant stems, and when you cut those stems and take them away, then you lose the overwintering stage of that insect. So by leaving refuge uncut areas, which some people tend to think of as scruffy or perhaps just saving money, but by leaving these uncut refuge areas, then we are able to allow insects to overwinter, or indeed many kinds of invertebrates, not just insects. And each year we are rotating the uncut area so that we don't get scrub developing, and you get different patterns of cutting each year. And this new cutting regime has promoted, I wouldn't say it's entirely responsible for, but it's promoted colonisation by meadow brown butterflies, skippers of these two species, the Essex and the small skipper, and six-spot burnet, all counted in good numbers this year, along with quite a few other moths. And we hope for more to colonise soon. We have the right plants growing there, bird's foot trefoil, for the common blue. This is the food plant for the common blue, and we're really hoping that more and more species will move in. Now we're giving them the chance to overwinter. Now, of course, Hyde Park is our premier events site. It has a huge pressure of people visiting it, and has to host certain kinds of concerts. Concerts with 100,000 visitors is quite common in Hyde Park. This one posed special issues. It was the Live 8 concert in July 2005, and a crowd of over 200,000 attended. Now, bearing in mind that we are keeping areas of the park tranquil for wildlife, this posed somewhat of a threat. But, in fact, though the area of the park which was actually stamped on, as it were, by the visitors, looked a bit like this when it was finished, by very, very careful management of those crowds and by closing selected areas of the park, our very experienced park staff, very good at crowd management, very good at managing these sorts of situations, left the meadow, just 2 days later, this photograph of the meadow, completely untouched. So what I'm really saying here is that Hyde Park can actually deliver both biodiversity gains and host a certain amount of intensive events. And this is something, of course, we're very much looking forward to when it comes to the Olympics, an interesting balancing act as the parks become a focus for Olympic events. Now, we're not just abandoning the parks to wildlife, we continue to maintain really the highest possible standards of horticulture, both formal and informal plantings. But we are changing our grassland management to help wildlife in all the royal parks. Really, without exception, there are areas of relaxed management or specific management for wildlife in all the parks. Here on the banks of the lake in St James's Park, you can see wildflowers have been allowed to grow not to a height, but at a fairly low level. So we've got plants like bird's foot trefoil here you can see growing on the bankside. And in the park, this is a restaurant designed by Sir Michael Hopkins and is an extremely high-quality restaurant and has a distinctive green roof, which blends into the Nash design landscape extremely well. Now, this is the front of that, overlooking the lake, and to the front of that, we've been working on changing the grassland there to a more meadow wildflower management. Now, this is gardening with wildflowers, but it nevertheless is very good for native species. Similar things in Regent's Park. Now, the Regent's Park has a very large sports complex. It's a premier sports site for the Royal Parks, but that doesn't mean that, again, we have to abandon the needs of wildlife, and we've been reverting what was previously very, very tedious ryegrass amenity grassland to much more biodiverse floral meadows. And this is done through quite drastic measures, the use of weed killers to strip away the old vegetation and replanting new stuff. But it works, and you end up with attractive, and I do believe this is very attractive plants which gradually evolve into a more natural community as time goes on, and attracts and feeds a good deal of our native wildlife. And relaxed management, well, perhaps the term relaxed implies that we're sort of lackadaisical, but what we mean here is the opposite of intensive management. We're not clipping it every 5 minutes, we're not fertilising it and so on. This is non-intensive management. Has really paid off. Kensington Gardens has beautiful informal grasslands, which I really admire. And interestingly, this year we noticed that heather was regenerating in just a small area, about 50 metres, just north of the, well, there it is, the Albert Memorial. And heath in London is an extraordinarily rare habitat. So to have some spontaneously, and it does seem to be spontaneously coming back in Kensington Gardens, is really quite a triumph. Small beginnings, but nevertheless, I think a very, very positive outcome. Greenwich Park, the same. The steep scarp slopes in Greenwich Park are a real feature of the park, and we've been managing them as grasslands, longer grasslands for some time now. But again, since 2003, we've started rotational cutting of areas to encourage invertebrates. Greenwich also has another secret, and that is its acid grassland. This is an area known as Crooms Hill in Greenwich, and this is showing the characteristic sort of maroon sward you get from sheep sorrel, Rumex acetosella, which is a characteristic acid grassland plant. And this is the food plant of the small copper, and I'm rather hoping that as this grassland is allowed to develop much more, we're going to attract many more of these sorts of species to that area. Now, previously, that area was intensively mown, but the management and I there have worked out a regime where this area is cut much less intensively, and acid grassland is regenerating on this site. So what, may you ask, is acid grassland, perhaps? You wouldn't, I don't know. Doesn't sound good, does it? Acid grassland sounds unpleasant. Lowland acid grassland, which is what we have down here in the south, is a UK Biodiversity Action Plan priority habitat. And it's a specialised grassland which develops on free draining, usually, acidic soils that are poor in nutrients. And this acidity and low levels of nutrients are vital, because what it does, it keeps away the coarse grasses that would suppress and compete with wildflowers. Now, in this particular case, we only have fine grasses, and this is much better for wildflowers. There's much less competition for them. So you get a particular community of grasses and wildflowers. Harebells are one of the plants that tend to be a nice species that crop up in acid grassland, though harebell itself, of course, is not confined to acid grassland. Now, this soil type occurs throughout London, but most acid grasslands are degraded, and the Biodiversity Action Plan is seeking to conserve what's here and to restore as much as possible. When you look at acid grassland that's been undisturbed for some time, you get this characteristic tussockiness from the yellow ants which build their nests there. The fine grasses and wildflowers are usually apparent. And the London Biodiversity Partnership is something we're very much involved with. We have, if people want to ask me afterwards which action plans we're involved with, I've got a whole list of them, both at borough and London level. Now, this partnership aims to deliver London's Biodiversity Action Plan, and we do have this regional Biodiversity Action Plan. And for acid grassland, Royal Parks are the lead partner, and I'm the lead for the Royal Parks. This is what acid grassland can look like in this part of Richmond Park. Richmond and Bushy Parks have between them something in the order of 280 hectares of high-quality acid grassland. They have more of what one could call acidic grassland that perhaps isn't quite in the same league, but about 280 hectares between them. This here you can see a sort of characteristic maroon flush of agrostis grasses, their flower heads in July. Earlier in the year you see festuca flowering heads, which are sort of more pale greener colour. And our main control of these grasses, our main management of these grasses, is natural grazing in Bushey and Richmond Park by our herds of deer. In Richmond Park there's a herd of about 300 red deer and about 350 fallow deer. In Bushey Park the total deer count's about 320, about half the size park, half the deer herd. There's the fallow deer as well. Two distinctively different species of deer as managed as wild herds within our parks. Of course, deer aren't the only grazers. There are rabbits and there are a whole bunch of voles and some huge biomasses of invertebrates as well, chewing away on the grasses and the wildflowers in there. So though I might showcase the deer, it's not the only thing on the in the show. Some of our acid grassland has quite a content of bracken, quite a lot of bracken there, but bracken tends to be a little bit invasive, as well as being a habitat in its own right. What's known as U20 grassland is bracken-covered acid grassland, as well as being useful in its own right. It also tends to encroach and impinge on other areas where we've got ant-hilly acid grassland. So we do manage the bracken using non-intensive measures like this. This is rolling the bracken using the team of Shire horses that's based in Richmond Park. And it's cut as well in some areas, and the fantastic result of that is that we can compost the bracken and make a peat-free compost as a byproduct of this work. So it's left to compost for somewhat over a year, and then it's added to other compost and makes an excellent ericaceous compost. So this means that the parks are using far less peat, almost eradicating it completely from their horticultural practice. I'd like to give you a flavour of how wonderful acid grassland is. You go there, it often doesn't look that good because a lot of the interest is quite small. So I'm just going to show you a few of these plants that you find growing in acid grassland. As it says there, about 50 species of grasses, sedges and rushes are found in Richmond Park, and I'd expect something very similar for Bushey as well. So just a few of the species here. I won't read them all out, just let you have a look at them and then move on. So not just grasses, of course, but lots of wildflowers as well. Harebells are pretty nice. They're out now in the autumn or late summer, and they're a nice thing to spot. But did the button go? Let's do it again. It might surprise many to know that bracken-covered acid grassland is a very good substitute for woodland. Basically, bluebells want shade early in the year. They want shade, but early in the year they want light. So as the bracken develops just a bit later than the bluebells, the bracken then provides a canopy, and the bluebells really like that. If you go to Richmond Park in the spring, you'll find it covered in native bluebells. It's extremely nice. Of course, they tend to get eaten as well, but it's a fine sight. Some rarities, upright chickweed. There are only 2 or 3 sites in London where Moenchia erecta can be found. Heath dog violets, again pretty unusual in London. Heath milkwort too. Again, just some pictures of typical acid grassland species that you can find in our parks. Lesser stitchwort found in a variety of habitats, but also on our acid grasslands. Mouse-eared hawkweed, that's a very characteristic acid species. And really, there's just an enormous variety of stuff. Perhaps one of the ones that people notice the most is tormentil, very beautiful little yellow flower, Potentilla erecta. Now, when you manage for this kind of habitat, you almost automatically get a lot of invertebrates living in it as well, all different kinds. And I don't want to really go on about any particular one very much. What we tend to do is talk about the ones people are likely to see or can recognise without too much knowledge. In fact, over 546 species of butterflies and moths are known from Richmond Park. And this really is a tremendous resource. And the other parks also have a very good stock of invertebrates of this kind. I won't bore you with figures for all the parks, but Greenwich Park, for example, quite a small park, only 74 hectares. A recent butterfly and moth survey came up with well over 300 species. So we're gradually auditing and discovering what's in our parks and trying to take them into account in our management. One extreme rarity, the double line moth, Methymna turca, that's found in both Richmond and Bushy Parks. Until last year, we didn't know it was in Bushy Park, but again, the first proper moth and butterfly survey of Bushy Park revealed it to us. Richmond Park is a stronghold for this moth. It's the only site other than Wimbledon Common that it occurs in the whole of the southern-eastern region of London. Southern-eastern region of the UK. It's just one of over 160 nationally notable or red data book invertebrates that we know of in the park. In fact, that 160 figure is well out of date. At the moment, I'm pretty convinced there's something close to 200 in there at the moment, but we haven't finished counting all the latest data. And our knowledge of these key taxa is gradually increasing. Spider surveys carried out throughout the parks over the last 10 years has gradually revealed very interesting faunas, which, again, we're seeking to conserve in our management. One surprise, perhaps, for many people was that solitary bees and wasps are also very important in the parks. These, there's about well over 500 species nationally, but in our region, the conditions for these is extremely good. The dry, free-draining sandy soils are ideal burrowing habitat. Now, we don't know the biodiversity of these creatures in most of our parks, but they have been well studied now in Richmond and Bushy Park. And over 160 species have been discovered of these solitary bees and wasps alone. And both are among the top 10 sites in Middlesex, with at least 10 red data book species amongst them. So, again, getting more information, getting more knowledge tells us that actually it's good to have some bare areas in our grass. It's good to have some eroded and trampled patches, because these are the sites that provide very good nesting habitat for these creatures. Things that the visitors don't see, small mammals, things of that kind. You just don't know they're there unless you actually set some live catch traps and look for them. When you do look for them, you find field voles, bank voles, wood mice, yellow-necked mice, common shrews, pygmy shrews, a whole range of small mammals. And these small mammals, of course, are part of a food chain themselves. These shrews are insectivorous. The other mammals are either herbivorous or more omnivorous. And these provide food for kestrels and owls, other predatory birds, and indeed other predatory mammals, which are also in our outer parks. So we're looking at a management here which tries to keep ecological processes going to actually have a functional ecosystem within the park. It's not easy to achieve in formal parks, but in outer parks like Richmond and Bushy, the work is slightly done for us by the fact that these are long-established habitats, and they've been colonised by a functional system. Of course, our most spectacular mammals in our parks are the deer. They're the ones people are likely to see. There are herds, as I've said before, in Bushy, in Greenwich and in Richmond, the largest herd being in Richmond. They're pretty impressive animals, and I don't know if any of you have been watching Autumn Watch, but if you've not ever seen rutting deer before, rutting red deer are pretty spectacular animals, and you can see them. You don't have to go to Rum. You can see them on your doorstep in Richmond and Bushy Park, and also in Greenwich. Fantastic animals. You can smell them as well when you're there. It's not like watching them on TV. It's slightly scary. It's much more interesting. And it's not just deer that are spectacular. We have historic landscapes that have fantastic ancient trees in them. Here, for example, is an ancient oak, part of a medieval hedge line that was there before Richmond Park was enclosed in 1637. And we have ancient trees of many, many species. And again, at the risk of giving you lists, here are just a few. 17th century sweet chestnuts in Greenwich Park, a real feature, beautiful trees. At the moment, we haven't surveyed them for their wildlife interest, but that's going to come. Ancient hawthorns. These don't look old. They look small, don't they? But some of these hawthorns are well over 300 years old and support quite an interesting invertebrate fauna. But we have native black poplar, apple, willow, beech, you name it. Even ancient exotics like robinia and so on, which are surprisingly interesting. Richmond Park itself is an internationally important site for ancient trees, and I mean internationally important, not just important in the country. It has around 100,000 trees, and about 1,200 of those are ancient trees. And they support a very rich wildlife indeed. So I'm not pressing hard enough on the thing. The rough bark and crevices are home to many, many species indeed. Lichens and fungi live on that bark. Well, some lichens and fungi. We'll come back to that later. They provide homes for spiders, ants, beetles, all kinds of things. And also the cavities and holes in the trees are refuges for hole-nesting birds. Again, too many to list. I'm going to just show you an owl. And also bats. And our parks are important both as foraging areas and as roosting sites for bats. Bats, of course, being European protected species. Now, very, very important in providing all this wildlife interest associated with trees are fungi. And it can't be overstated, really, how important the fungi are, particularly heart rot fungi. They do not kill the trees. They rot only away on the dead wood in the core of the tree, not the living timber. And in fact, they do the tree a favour by hollowing out branches. They save weight, and the resulting hollow cylinders are actually just as strong as the original solid cylinders. So the trees are not weakened by the fungi. They're actually prolonged in their life by the fungi. And they're adapted to dealing with them. They're adapted to coping with fungal infection, walling it off, and avoiding serious damage to themselves. Of course, there are some pathogenic fungi, but the majority aren't. Now, fungi like these create habitat by creating the rot and releasing nutrients for species to use. The trees themselves, later in their life cycle, will actually use the released nutrients from their own degraded interiors. They frequently plunge roots back into the centre of the tree. And many of the fungi are rare in themselves. For example, the rare oak polyphore, which is one of the very few species of nationally important fungi that we know we have, but it occurs on a few trees in Richmond Park, and again, this is a UK priority species. Now, decaying wood in ancient trees is a real priority for us, whether it's in standing dead wood, standing living wood, or lying dead wood. And it's very, very important, and we seek to conserve it wherever possible. Obviously, there are limits in our formal parks, but we do keep standing dead wood whenever we can. The stag beetle, which lives in decaying stumps underground, is a flagship species for Richmond Park, and its designation as a European SAC. That's the species named for its designation. But this is just one of many, many species of decaying wood species that live in the park. What we do is we enhance the habitat in other parks, but also in Richmond, by creating these loggeries. They're kind of like artificial stumps buried in the ground. The larvae live in those, eating the decaying timber and moving in and out of the soil for up to around 7 years before the adults hatch. Creating these loggeries actually provides the necessary lack of disturbance in the habitat for them to complete that long life cycle. Now, there are over 1,350 beetle species recorded for Richmond Park. We're doing resurvey work now. The number of decaying wood specialists is at least 319, and we now know that we have at least 6 Red Data Book 1 species amongst those. Now, these are the subject of current study, and previously there had been no audit before since the 80s, and so it's very important to update our knowledge of what we have. Are we managing them right? Are we doing things right? And what we're doing now is these data collected in a standardized way will provide a baseline study for future comparisons about the success of our management. As it stands now, Richmond is the 5th best site in the UK for decaying wood invertebrates. Now, there's a real problem with our trees. Many of them are actually a bit top-heavy, liable to collapse. And so we must make them safe, not only for themselves. We don't want to lose, they don't collapse, losing 2 for the price of 1 collapse. Now, each of our veteran trees has an individual management program within an overall 30-year management plan. And they're all very much individuals. Here, for example, we've reduced the length of this very long limb here. It's still quite long, but the ends have been taken off to create less leverage on the vulnerable part of the tree here. And you'll notice that we use what are known as natural fracture cuts, which mimic natural breakage and are much better for colonizing fungi and wildlife. And we believe actually the tree reacts better to this as well than traditional flush cuts. We're also working to create the next generation of oak pollards using young trees and crown reducing them progressively to create a more traditional oak pollard form, because there's a lapse in pollard management of something in the order of 200 years, generation gap. So we're quite keen to redress that as soon as possible. Now, our ancient trees are actually very vulnerable. Compaction of the root zone is a serious threat, and we'll be seeking to move paths like this away from underneath the crown wherever we can. Fires in trees are a constant hazard. Yes, there are natural fires from lightning strikes, but these are in the minority. Most fires are started by people who not only use the hollow trees as litter bins, but also occasionally decide they're going to stuff a disposable barbecue in the base of a hollow tree because it's too hot to take home. And though, of course, all fires are not permitted in the Royal Parks, it's very difficult to prevent everybody from doing this. This hollow oak was actually quite lucky to survive a blaze to its interior. Decaying wood that's lying around is also very important for our wildlife, and this is great. In high wood, there's lots of decaying wood here, very high density, and fully meets the sort of conservation guidelines that we have. But people like to play with it, and it really is not good for our decaying wood fauna to be hoisted into the air to desiccate in a sort of, no matter how Andy Goldsworthy it looks, or no matter how delightful it must have been to create that den, it's really not good for the conservation. The challenge here is how to try and encourage people not to do things like that without being spoil sports. Now, we do work in concert, I've put here, I'm not sure I like that word anymore, where we work together with other land and tree managers, sharing our experience. This is a group of the Royal Forestry Society visiting us, and we visit other sites on a regular basis. And we've also produced, in partnership with Richmond Borough, a decaying wood leaflet. It could be downloaded from the Richmond Borough website if you're interested. Encouraging people to manage their dead wood for invertebrates. And during our open days and also as volunteers, groups of people like this is the beetle team, as I'm just calling them now. They could be called hundreds of things. But this is at the most recent Richmond Park Open weekend in July. And these stalwart people are helping us promote the cause of decaying wood and beetles in the parks, and also actually acting as volunteers for the fieldwork as well. Shifting now completely to something else, reed bed work in the Royal Parks is now pretty normal. At least 5 Royal Parks have reed bed creation projects. The Longwater in Hyde Park has beautiful natural-looking banks with reeds that have been planted there by our wildlife officers, and the results are very successful. Recent moth surveys found at least 16 species not previously known in the park associated with these wetland habitats. And in St James's Park, we've been engaging the industry, as it were. This is the publishing house Reed Elsevier, providing us with not only £24,000 of sponsorship, but also a team of willing workers to actually plant a marginal habitat, reed bed, merely because they're called reed and they're feeling generous. Well, it's interesting that they should be prepared to sponsor, through the London Biodiversity Partnership, the Reed Bed Habitat Action Plan, just because of coincidence in name. But nevertheless, we're very grateful they're doing so. Early results show quite a nice growth of the plants. This is less than a year after the original planting. Other smaller projects, like creating small wetland areas in Regent's Park, the silt pen, this year this was attracting kingfishers and a large number of different dragonflies. Now, I've painted a pretty rosy picture, but of course not everything is perfect. There are lots of issues affecting biodiversity in the parks, and it's not wise to duck them. Of course, some of the things that we've lost over the years are things that have declined for wider reasons than just what's going on in the Royal Parks. Red squirrels, last recorded in Richmond Park in 1919. Brown hare, last record in 1972. Alarmingly recent, that, isn't it? House sparrow, major decline going along across London at the moment. So we are losing things, and many have become rarer or locally extinct. For example, you wouldn't find hedgehogs in the Central Royal Parks other than Regent's Park. It's the only Central Royal Park with hedgehogs in it now, whereas they used to be common 30 years ago. What's behind all this, it's difficult to be sure, but certainly our parks are under pressure from the whole urban package. Vehicle emissions, noise pollution, they all negatively affect wildlife. And if you want proof, then look at the bark of this tree. It's a lovely oak tree, but it isn't covered in lichens, as one would see if you went to Devon or Cornwall or somewhere like that. Our area is not as clean as it should be, and we are missing this community of species which should be dressing our trees. That's not to say we have nothing. We have actually quite a few lichens in the parks, and lichen enthusiasts have got quite a good species list. It's still not as good as it should be. But these lichens are pollution-tolerant species that are doing quite well in the parks, and it's not a bad contribution, but we've got to acknowledge the fact that the parks are under pressure, and these are the visible signs of pressure. There are less visible ones. Many species are vulnerable to disturbance. For example, the Pen Ponds in Richmond Park is host to overwintering ducks and so on during the winter. They're very, very vulnerable indeed to disturbance, and also birds during the breeding season are very vulnerable to disturbance. These dogs chasing into the water can be a real turn-off for these birds, and they frequently nip off somewhere quieter like the Wildfowl and Wetlands Centre. Dog fouling is a major issue. It's probably the most significant threat, certainly the most controllable threat, to our acid grasslands, which rely on their nutrient-poor status for their richness. And the added nutrients simply change the grassland to coarse grasses and weeds, displace the natural community entirely. All around the car parks in Bushey and Richmond Park, you can see that habitat change as the dog fouling has its effect. We also have problems of controlling invasive exotics, and there are many of those. I'm just picking one here, an invasive species like Crassula helmsii. This is the New Zealand pygmy weed, or Australian stonecrop as it's sometimes called. This is very, very difficult to eradicate. It regenerates from the tiniest fragment of plant material. And controlling this, which has come into our ponds often as people kindly donate us their frogs or other pond wildlife and then bring this to us. Of course, it's completely illegal to do this, and I really wish they wouldn't. But these issues of how to control this are very difficult indeed. Some of them are, as I'd go so far as to say, they're intractable problems. But some we can do something about. Over the last 3 decades, volunteers' records have shown a very serious decline in skylarks in Richmond Park, also somewhat of a decline in Bushy Park, but not so serious. The skylark's a red-listed bird. It's declined nationally more than 50% in the last 30 years. This is just to illustrate a sequence of slides to illustrate the loss. This is in 1968. This is in 1999, roughly. And this is roughly now. And clearly, we were seeking to act to try and redress this loss. And in order to do that, we had to carry out some study to direct ourselves. And between 2001 and 2005, volunteers counted breeding bird territories in this area, the control study area, and the study area itself, which we set up as a skylark protection zone. This is right adjacent to a very busy car park in the centre of one of the busiest parts of Richmond Park. What we did is we erected signs asking people to keep their dogs on a short lead during the breeding season and to stick to paths, in other words, not to go off track. And you'd think, well, you know, can that work? There's so much going on in the park, there's so many factors at play. Our volunteers counted the territories of the skylark ones, of these purple ones here, and over the 4 years, and indeed over the 5 years, there's just not room for the 5th slide, the numbers of breeding territories increased. To summarise this in graph form, you can see the numbers are small, I know, and this is hardly a sort of large-scale replicable study. I'd have a devil of a job getting it published. But what you can see is a sustained improvement in the number of skylarks on the experimental site. But on the control site, we've lost, actually, the remaining skylark completely. Overall, ground nesting bird territories have increased by 38%, whereas they've declined by 33% on the control site. I think what this allows us to say is that it worked. Okay, we've only doubled the numbers from 3 to 6 on that site, but it's nevertheless given us a direction for how we can think about reducing the impacts of visitor pressure on our skylarks. And this is the challenge we face, to manage our visitor pressure so that it doesn't negatively affect the quality of the park and its wildlife, and yet still allow people to come and enjoy with reasonable freedom. Now, we do need understanding of our park visitors for this, and understanding and working with our friends groups to achieve it. And we are doing this, we're engaging with the public. It's very much part of our public walks and talks program. This is in Greenwich, this is in Richmond. And we're also working with schools as a part of a wider education program. This is a Palace for the 21st Century project, which we did in Greenwich this summer. And this is a schools-based stroke borough initiative to helping students understand more about sustainable development. And we had a 5-day session with the students visiting in these tented areas in Greenwich Park, with workshops every day for the students. And we feel this was a great success, and we've learned a great deal from running that. We're also improving our interpretation. This is a slow process. You can't expect overnight changes. A lot of investment and time goes into this. This is a nature trail leaflet for Spankers Hill and Penn Ponds, which I've developed for Richmond Park. And new notice boards for the National Nature Reserve, just to give a flavour of what the park's got to offer. And these have been extremely popular, and you always see people looking at them and talking about what they're looking at. So I hope that what this has done, despite, it's a bit corny, isn't it? Running slightly over length, I'm sorry, but hopefully I've given you a flavour of what's being done to manage for biodiversity in the Royal Parks, and I hope you'll agree that we really are trying to do our best to do so. Thank you.
Gresham clock does give us 10 minutes for questions, and I think a huge amount of information has come. Hands going up all over the place, sprouting everywhere, madam.
Sorry. I'm a grateful recipient of everything in Kensington Gardens. I'd like to know what's happened to the Henry Moore statue. I'd like to know why all the maps in the last 5 years have been round the wrong way, and I'm always telling people about it. I saw a baby hedgehog about 5 years ago near Peter Pan. And
that's interesting. Yes.
Yes. And do we have any bush crickets that we can listen to in that area?
Yes.
Really?
I'm taking the last question first, which is a neat trick. There are bush crickets in Kensington Gardens and Hyde Park. That's known as Rosel's bush cricket. Very common indeed, and they're quite hard to hear because they stridulate, produce their noise at quite a high frequency. But if you look in the grass, you'll see them. They're quite abundant. I'm afraid I really can't answer your questions about statues and things. That's really not my area. I'm sorry. Well, the Henry Moore statue's in Greenwich Park. I didn't know there was ever a Henry. I've worked for the parks for 4 years. Yes, but that's in Greenwich Park. Oh, well, maybe there is one, but I don't know it. Yes. Oh, right. No. Yes.
I gather there's a problem with the horse chestnut trees in Richmond Park. Is there a cure for the disease?
There's a problem with horse chestnut trees throughout the region. In fact, the whole of south east England now is affected by the horse chestnut leaf miner, which is known as Cameraria oridella. And it's a small moth, and it mines the leaf of the horse chestnut and does severe damage to the foliage. No, there isn't a cure, I'm afraid. It's a pest species that's come in the last 4 or 5 years. It's expanded dramatically, as pest species often do, and there is no real way of dealing with this other than hoping that this damps down in a natural sort of way. Horse chestnuts are under all kinds of pressure already, and this is not doing them any favours at all. But there really isn't much we can do. You can collect leaves, which does interrupt the overwintering stages of the moth, but it's really just a drop in the ocean in terms of action. They blow on the winds. I mean, you can only see how they spread. They'll move in from adjacent sites, and with 5+ generations a year, they expand their numbers enormously. So I'm afraid, no, we just have to watch it happen and see how we can respond appropriately. Yeah.
Could you just tell us a bit more about a biodiversity action plan? You mentioned it several times, and I just wondered what it was all about.
Yes, indeed. In 1998, the United Kingdom produced a national biodiversity action plan, which is an administrative process, if you like, by which people form partnerships and sign up to actions to promote biodiversity in various ways, and to try and target the work, they identified a number of priority habitats and species which we should address. And those have devolved into local action plans which are taken up by boroughs, by regions and counties, and indeed in some cases by organisations. And what these do is provide action targets for us to actually work to. So it's a way of formalising the conservation work that's being done, but also providing some kind of incentive. You know, you commit to a target. We will have restored so much grassland by a certain date. We will have produced so many educational leaflets for schools and so on by a certain date. Most of the work is done by partnerships, and the Royal Parks are very proud to be partners in large numbers of biodiversity action plans. Quite a responsibility, actually.
And you use the phrase nationally notable. Is that has a particular significance, does it?
Yes, I mean these are tricky questions because there's a whole classification. I anticipated this question. There's a whole classification from Red Data Book species, where RDB1, Red Data Book 1, is really a very rare and seriously threatened species, or potentially seriously threatened species, through to other RDB categories, including ones for unknown or insufficiently known. And then there's also a series of nationally notable, interchangeably known as nationally scarce categories, which look to see how many of the 10 kilometre squares nationally these species occur in. So if something's nationally notable, it has a restricted distribution, and its nationally notable category depends on how restricted. And I hope that answers your question.
Always helps, yes.
Yes.
The deer, which we see in the picture here.
Yes.
National Trust, which runs Morden Park in South London, used to have a herd of deer there, and they had to remove them because they got vandalised by the local population. So my question is about the relationship between these animals and your 30 million visitors or whatever it was, and also really to see whether you see there being a threat to animals of this nature, or whether, on the other hand, whether you see there's a prospect of, say, reintroducing sheep in Hyde Park. You know, which way are we moving?
That's. I think we're moving towards the latter. I'm not sure that we're ready for sheep in Hyde Park at the moment. They'd have to be very, very carefully looked after. Their welfare would be, a serious issue in a park like that. But we are moving much more towards natural management, using grazing animals and so on, than away from that position. Indeed, we're looking at the moment at the possibility of increasing the diversity of our grazing in parks such as Richmond Park and Bushy Park by having a limited amount of cattle grazing, for example, very targeted cattle grazing as a trial. And indeed, as part of my appointment to the job I now have, one of the questions that I was asked to look at as part of my interview scenario was what about introduction of sheep for Hyde Park Meadow? And it's very much on the map. The question is how to do it well, not to rush into things and do things in a way that's bound to fail. So we are considering these things, but it's not an easy thing to manage.
Nigel, the Royal Society is obviously very concerned with biodiversity, and yet you've got people who can identify 150 species of spiders, 1,500 species of beetles. Where do these people come from?
Well, I tell you, however they arrive, I'm so grateful to them. Invertebrate specialists are a breed apart. They're very important people, and one of the real worries is that many of them are knocking on a bit in years, and there won't be a new generation of invertebrate specialists to replace them. I mean, at the moment, there's still enough people around. But for example, the beetle work that's been done in Richmond Park is done by Dr. Peter Hammond, who's a national expert on beetles, and used to work for the Natural History Museum. And he's actually identifying the current catch of the beetles we're sampling at the moment in Richmond Park for us. Spiders, there's a wonderful guy called Edward Milner who currently will do spider surveys if we can pay him. And David Baldock, for example, an amateur enthusiast, provided us with all the records for burrowing bees and wasps that we have in Richmond and Bushy Park. So these are tremendous people, and we're enormously indebted to them. I can't possibly do this. You have to be really quite specialised. But we do have to know who they are and make sure that we make good use of those people, yes. Mm.
Yes. I was crossing St James's Park recently, and on 3 occasions a large rat ran across my way.
Yep.
How do you deal with having what might be considered by some to be undesirable species, perhaps developing urban foxes and rats?
Well, we do have a pest control policy, which is a sort of a matter of public record, and where things like rats, for example, particularly if they're associated with areas where people gather, feed ducts, catering outlets, these sorts of things, we do control those using qualified pest control people. We have our own wildlife officers. One of their roles is to carry out that pest control when necessary. But we only do it where we believe that it will actually work. And we'd much rather avoid the problem in the first place. Generally speaking, if people didn't excessively feed birds and squirrels, and there was no food waste from the catering outlets, there would not be a problem with rats. And not that we actually do have a problem with rats. There are some rats around. So we think we'd rather deal with it at source. In Regent's Park, for example, we have a situation where people actually really excessively overfeed, putting leftover dinner basically out along the lakeside. And this is basically just feeding these sorts of animals, pigeons, rats, and so on. But where necessary, we do need to control them, yes.
Well, I'm afraid it's a strict tradition of ours that we stop at 2 o'clock and we can't persuade Jeff to push the minute hand back by a few minutes. I am absolutely overwhelmed by the visual presentation. I think this is the very best visual presentation we've ever had. I will never ever go into a park again and say, oh, grass. Don't walk on the grass, I shall say. Which species, my good man?
Yes.
Absolutely tremendous. I have to say that sometimes we think of the royal parks as being sort of kind of open space amenities with park keepers and waste paper baskets. And I think it's intriguing the way to see here how the parks are being almost regenerated as open land and the tremendous potential that exists even in the centre of London. So I think that was a tremendous eye-opener and very well presented, and thank you so much for those slides. They were
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.